A very good afternoon and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to today's Hindu News Analysis for 28th May 24, where we shall be talking about some important news articles picked up from the perspective of your UPSC Mains, which need a detailed analysis. With this, we shall also analyze few articles which are quite factual, short and important from the prelims perspective. Now, the most important articles which we shall be looking at from the main standpoint are ranging from ecology to India's foreign policy, particularly with respect to West Asian countries. Now, we start by taking up an article from page 7, and all these articles have been picked up from the Hindu New Delhi edition of today. The first article, as you can see, talks about human-animal conflict. Now, again, it's not a new issue. It has been making news for a very long time now. However, this particular article is relating in a very fascinating way the link between people's cultural aspirations and how they play a part when we understand the dynamics of human-animal conflict. On the face of it, it looks like a pure ecological problem. However, it has a much deeper root to it. In fact, it is people's religious and cultural beliefs which has given this new complex shape to human-animal, particularly human-cattle conflict, and we shall be focusing on the Terai region, the extremely fertile alluvial region from the state of Uttar Pradesh. The second article here talks about the Chabahar Port and how India's willing connection with the politics happening in Iran, particularly India's ease of trade with respect to Chabahar Port. What does it mean for foreign policy in a region which is battered by ongoing war? We can talk about the constant Israel-Palestine war. In fact, today's article also highlighted how the recent spate of attacks by Israel has attracted global condemnation. Most countries of the world have vowed to take an action on that. And this was page number 6. The last article for mains is a controversy whether it is a smart idea to replace native species of trees with exotic species of trees. Although there are certain rules and certain protocols that the government is following here, every tree, every crop has a certain rotation cycle, but even when their rotation cycle is over, does it make sense to chop off the native trees and just replace them by exotic ones like eucalyptus? Could it be a very good, in fact a helpful move, given the climate crisis and huge air toxicity that we are experiencing? So what should the government do? Should the government go back to growing native species again? And what are certain ramifications of allowing species like eucalyptus to take over the native species in India? With that comes the prelims segment, where the articles are really short for the day. So we are talking about cyclone. I'm sure you know about it. It's all over the news right now, and how it has made a landfall. So the entire Bay of Bengal region has experienced not just rainfall, but also there was a lot of weather turbulence, particularly in Kolkata. So we'll have a quick look at that. Now, the last article for the day talks about how Ghana, an African nation, is tying up with Reliance Jio in order to boost its connectivity, that is mobile connectivity, the 4G, 5G spectrum. The reason is to follow the footsteps of India, which is soon going to be the third largest economy, just say in a couple of years. So now it becomes an inspiration model to many such developing countries to take up this telecommunication revolution. So with that, we start now delving deep into the first news piece of the day. This is page 7 and it corresponds to your GS paper 3, Environment Ecology. The article says, where animals are dying by 1,000 cuts. Now the title itself sounds very gruesome. When we say by 1,000 cuts, we are trying to highlight, the article is trying to highlight how the recent findings have pointed out to a very bizarre, at the same time also a very painful reality. On the one hand, we talk about preserving wildlife. On the one hand, we talk about creating wildlife corridors to enable a smooth movement of wild animals. Say, for example, elephants, wild buffaloes from one region to another. But in many farmlands of Uttar Pradesh, particularly the middle and southern belt of Uttar Pradesh, Of late, animal activists are pointing to a new kind of brutality which cattle are experiencing. Not just cattle, also wild animals, but particularly the cattle population. These are known as stray cattle. The article uses a very colloquial term that locally it's also known as the chutta cattle, which means a cattle on which nobody is making a claim or ownership. And these are hordes of stray cattle which are just wandering from one farm to another, obviously in search of food. Now, the farmers who are wary of this kind of unannounced cattle attack, food loss, crop loss, they are taking strict measures. So they are pooling resources and now going for electrocution. They are protecting their farms by using very, very high voltage electricity wires, sometimes very sharp protection walls. These animals, they end up getting severely electrocuted, they end up getting severely injured, maimed. Gruesomely they are dying, and many such animal carcasses have been discovered by animal activists in the farm regions of Uttar Pradesh. But that's not all. On the face of it, it looks like a very ordinary problem. Of course, a deep problem, but also a very common problem. The problem of animal-human conflict, which is okay, which we have heard about before. But why this article is extremely fascinating, because it takes a whole new dimension, a very new look on this problem. It says that elections are happening right now, and when elections are round the corner, then every political party tries to tap into the sentiment of its voter base. So therefore, what is happening right now is that cow, which also means a lot of symbolic reverence, cow which also is deeply associated with religious cultural notions of people in North India, are now at a crossroads of two different political ideologies. All this actually started, as per the article, ever since in 1955, the transport and trade of cattle without government permission and adequate licensing has become illegal. So before that, we know that the meat industry was it is in fact quite prolific in Uttar Pradesh. In fact, when we talk about the pink revolution, which deals with an unprecedented rise in the production of certain crops like onions, it includes also meat processing industry, meat production industry, animal farming industry. UP has quite a major contribution here. So things were going in such a pattern for a very long time, and then it became a battle between economic need and cultural perception, where a lot of people, whom the article has called as cow vigilance, you may have heard the word, where people inspired by their religious ethos, inspired by cultural ethos, also sometimes ethical issues also come in the picture here. Animal protection wings, they completely prohibit, in fact they want to completely prohibit any kind of cattle supply for slaughtering purpose, especially milch cattle. Now this also resonates with one of our directive principles. In fact, if you remember that the government of India shall try to coordinate steps which would eventually prohibit people from slaughtering milch cattle which yield milk. Now at the heart of this controversy, you can give it the name of a welfare state, or you can give this a name of political religious ideology, but today what is happening is that cow trade therefore is becoming something which is happening, but it's happening under the table, because naturally there's a huge meat industry that's running. There is a lot of demand, and there are communities which for generations have dealt into meat processing industry. So for them, their only means of livelihood is sort of dealing with cattle. Therefore it also includes transportation of cattle, and on the other hand, we have people who want this to be prohibited, and therefore the government has taken some measures. Now a strange paradox has erupted. The trade is happening just like before. In fact, sometimes people say, the article says it's even more. It's a heavier trade that we are having in cattle trade and transportation both. But since it's illegal, it's happening under the table, it's happening in a hidden, clandestine way. Now what happens? It leads to more and more communal conflict over the issue of cattle transportation. So today, when the elections are around the corner, it becomes a very difficult dilemma for the government, that whether the government should attack the communities who are dealing in this transportation secretly, or should the government just stay quiet and let them do what they have to? Because before the elections, no political party wants to get its hands burnt into any such controversy. So you see, owing to this time, the problem of stray cattle has just increased and increased. So they have been just dumped behind, they have been left behind as a livestock of an economy which once was legal, but today it is not. So neither can people openly do the trade and claim that the cattle belongs to them, nor is the government ready to either punish those people who are doing the clandestine trade, or there is no clear-cut policy of providing fixed number of cow shelters within farms or under the government protection. So the cattle are just straying from one place to another. So on the one hand, definitely it leads to animal-human conflict. The cattle will obviously encroach upon farmlands. People will take action against them. It leads to animal brutality, which is not all right. And apart from that, the article also therefore says that the problem in the case of cattle-human conflict becomes very, very cultural and religious. Deep-rooted it is to do with that. So it's really disheartening to see that cattle is being cut off with razor-sharp wires, and there is nobody really who shall be responsible for this kind of animal gruesomeness that's happening. Now, apart from that, the article has also taken another dimension. It says that, of course, it's not fine. Neither is it good for the cattle population, nor is it good for the farmers whose farms are coming under rampage. But there's another issue here. Sometimes the cattle themselves become a prey to wild animals. Now, most of the villages, most of the farm, when we talk about the Terai region of Uttar Pradesh, we also know it's a very fertile area. You may have heard in your geography, it's the Bhabar that is more coarse and that's not so fertile. And then comes the Terai belt, which is known for its rich agriculture, its rich alluvial soil. Also it's known for its huge biodiversity. So various kind of wild animals are also endemic to this belt, let's remember. So most of the times, the villages and the farms are located in the vicinity, on the border of forest and residential areas. So what happens in this case? What happens is that fencing is not enough. Whenever stray cattle are roaming around, they also become an attraction for these wild animals to come and prey on them. Who suffers in the process? It is the human population, obviously, who will pay a price. And then a new picture starts of constant wildlife attacks. Wildlife animals getting strayed into highways and residential areas. Once again, it is a danger for the wildlife animals who anyways most of them in India are already either endangered or vulnerable. And on the other hand, of course, it's leading to fatalities among people as well. So therefore, all these areas of Uttar Pradesh, Pilibhit, Lakhimpur Kheri, Bahraich, they all correspond to this area which today is experiencing such kind of, on the one hand, religious ethical dilemma. On the other hand, constant animal brutality plus a danger to humans too. Now, apart from that, the article is also saying that such Terai belt is also sometimes a region of endangered species, as we said, of tigers, rhinoceros, swamp deers, Bengal floricle. So how safe are these animals? Now, once again, whether we talk about elephant protection, whether we talk about Wildlife Protection Act 72, we know that ultimately, until there is no proper geographic gap between human settlements and animal population, the problem of animal lack of safety, animal killings is not going to get sorted at all. Having said that, the article uses a very interesting way of expressing this conflict between human and animals. It also says that today, plethora of wildlife, so many wildlife animals and so many stray cattle who are losing their life to this conflict is absolutely unaccounted for. They are dying at an unparalleled rate. That's what the article says. Plus, another thing that article has pointed out too, that these cattle, when they are roaming from one region to another. Now let's remember, we are also living in a time of zoonotic diseases. Many of you may have heard about how ever since climate change has become a major issue, zoonotic diseases have also taken lives of many people by a toll. Now, when we talk about zoonosis, you never know. Sometimes organisms or microorganisms from animals, they can seep into the human system, and then they cause unprecedented, unknown kind of diseases. So again, it becomes a dilemma that when these stray cattle are roaming from one place to another, they are defecating. Could this also transmit some serious diseases such as bovine tuberculosis, which comes from cattle? The bacteria comes from cattle and it has a potential of entering the human populace. Whether we talk about the lumpy skin disease, now this is not unheard of. Last year we know that lumpy cow disease accounted for death of so many cattle. In fact, the milk supply in certain most milk productive regions of India, Gujarat, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, was also in danger. This is one side of it, economic loss, but the major side of it is also health problems that could be created because of this constant and unhealthy correspondence between human and stray cattle. Again, we also know that in most of the small town India and in villages, a proper solid waste management policy is not in practice even now. There is a lack of waste segregation, there is a lack of proper collection by authorities, municipalities. It's not uncommon to see heaps of garbage littered around. These become the hot spots of attracting cattle, stray cattle. It's from here that various kind of diseases also start, you can say, spreading. They just enter the underground water through drains, through canals, and then once an organism is in the ecosystem, it can have any ramification. It can lead to any unknown disease. And already, given that so many diseases that start from animal species and they're crossing the barrier and coming into human species is again one major concern. You may have heard about how the World Health Organization, since the last 5 years, has constantly warned people about a dangerous, unknown, unprepared for kind of pandemic breaking out in future, the disease X. We also know we are talking about the superbug era, so we cannot really afford to let these diseases seep into human population. So therefore, it also needs some kind of preventive measure, to control the population of the stray cattle, or at least provide them a safe, centered location. When we talk about social dynamics and livelihoods, another segment of the article, it says that today it is also true that farmers are themselves agreeing that the stray cattle menace is becoming too much to handle. If the farmers take a strict action against the cattle, it is considered as an attack on various communities and their religious beliefs, which is absolutely not acceptable socially in India. Apart from that, there is a situation where rising input costs and the rising cost of maintaining cattle which are not beneficial to maintain. For example, those cattle whose milk yielding capacities are not very good, or those cattle who because of old age or because of some disease are not productive for the farmers. The problems of disposing them becomes a very disputed issue really. So we all know that India also has a very flourishing, by the way, bovine meat industry. It's very paradoxical it sounds, but that's true. And at the same time, we also know most of these farmers are selling off the cattle for slaughtering purposes. But again, since it is not something that is socially acceptable, or it is not something which can be done legally, transportation can't take place. So farmers themselves are fed up with what to do with cattle which they cannot use anymore. So therefore, farmers are constantly requesting the government to create systematic cow shelters. There are some which are existing, but most of them are running by either NGOs or by donations. So the question is today, why can't we have a more multi-sectoral approach? Agreed that there are NGOs in the industry creating these cow shelters, there are animal-loving organizations, but then why can't the government also come up with more innovative ideas to create bigger, more systematic and more functional cow centers, cow shelters where the stray cattle could be accommodated, which will not just protect this battle further, but also it's in the good interest of both humans as well as the cattle population. So the government, now the article is also pointing out to a very upsetting irony. It says that today the government is spending more money on feeding stray cattle, much more money than the government ideally spends on vulnerable population and welfare schemes, particularly, for example, pension for widows in India. So it indicates the significance of this issue. It's not just an economic or political issue. It's deeply, deeply cultural, religious in nature. So let's talk about the election impact of all this. What shall be the electoral impact and what will be the voters' viewpoint when it comes to the problem of stray cattle and the menace they are creating? That's yet to be seen. And of course, the article has a much deeper theme here. It does talk about the intersection of religion, culture on the one hand, economic necessities and political ideologies. A very interesting write-up really. Now with this, we proceed with the second article for the day. This is page 6 and this is GS2, your international relations. What does it talk about? We are talking about the Chabahar Airport. Does it provide India multitude of opportunities? But then in the garb of these opportunities, are there some challenges which the government has been dealing with constantly? So the article just highlights the recent development where New Delhi, that's the Indian government at the center, has created a contract. It has finalized a contract with Iran under which India will invest and operate the Shahid Behzati terminal at the Chabahar airport for another 10 years to come. Isn't this a very remarkable development for two reasons? Reason one, already West Asian region is under a lot of turmoil. Besides, we also know that India's ideological backing of Israel could also have been something which would have prevented this deal from taking place. Now we know that recently Iran's leadership was in crisis, as the senior leaders had passed away. Apart from that, we also know about the Israel-Iran conflict where both of them had targeted each other. There was attacks going on. In fact, a lot of people did not refrain from saying that the recent accidental death of Iranian leadership was not a coincidence. In fact, it was something in which there was a clandestine hand of the political enemies at a global level. So all this shows a fact that India obviously had a very dicey situation. Investing in Iran, having such kind of a trade partnership with Iran means a lot at a point of time where US is wary of Iran. We know about the sanction story. At a point of time where Israel-Iran relations are under strain, and at a point of time where people associate Israel and India to have great comradeship, as well as the Palestine issue that's still going on, everyday attacks and war that's still parallelly going on. At this point of time, as India has taken up this strategic decision for its economic well-being, for its trade well-being, it talks volumes about the independent nature of India's foreign policy. In fact, the same question had also arisen when in the last few years or the last few months, India, although did not categorically criticize Moscow, but at the same time, India had supported relief campaigns in Ukraine. In fact, similarly with Palestine, India had expressed sympathy with all the genocides that were happening in Palestine. At that point of time, again, also foreign diplomats and critics were pointing out that isn't India's foreign policy nowadays slightly more, it's becoming day by day more aggressively independent, where India, although was essentially associated with non-alignment, but today India is fearlessly taking up on this mission of non-alignment. It is joining partnerships with countries where it feels its own interests have to be safeguarded. So this development comes on a very similar note, in fact. So the Chabahar Port is crucial for India, we know, economically as well as strategically. The biggest reason is that it is a very critical component of this whole project, the International North-South Transport Corridor. Another very good geopolitical benefit of this investment is that the Chabahar project link completely avoids any access to Pakistan. So that is also one huge benefit India has in dealing with West Asia through this port. So now Chabahar represents India's approach to its commitment with not just its neighbor first policy, at the same time preventing its own interest before thinking about any other global issue. So it is not just focus on West Asia as a neighbor, it's focus on what is right given India's economic needs as a growing economy right now, without being committed to just one country and its ideology. So the port plays a very important role in creating this connectivity, especially also with Afghanistan. In fact, it's very interesting that the Taliban-led government in Afghanistan has also shown and expressed a lot of support for the Chabahar port. Why? Essentially, even they want to avoid surpassing or bypassing the ports like Karachi and China's supported Gwadar port. So therefore, it becomes an interest factor for many countries who are wanting to avoid countries with way more aggressive and terroristic policies. So the Chabahar port also, the whole history dates back to 2003, if we see ever since the talks are going on, and despite the challenges which did occur in India-Iran relationship as we discussed, also because of India's supporting US stand, also because of India and Israel close ties, but despite that, it has become a huge milestone in India and West Asia connectivity. Also, it means a lot given the fact that many of the older bilateral ties and sanctions, they were dissolved because of the sanctions imposed by the US and because of the global attitude towards Iran's own military nuclear ambitions, there were a lot of sanctions, and due to that, many older bilateral ties had been finished. And since then, nobody would have ever imagined that, yes, another 10 years of partnership would continue, specifically with reference to the Chabahar Port. So therefore, it's a very interesting development as per the article. Now, talking about certain geopolitical dynamics associated here, the recent deal comes against so many tensions. We know the ongoing Israel-Palestine war and India's investments in both Chabahar Airport and Haifa Port in Israel. Now look at that. It looks like very paradoxical at the same time, but this again underscores India's diplomatic success, that on the one hand, India is ready, another 10 years of investment in Chabahar, at the same time also in Haifa Port in Israel. And both these countries who do not absolutely get along when it comes to geopolitical or global relationships, international relations. So which means that this is a huge diplomatic success for the country. And growing ties with various partners including US, Israel, as well as the Arabic nations. So which means that it's a huge laudatory step for India's foreign policy. Now, when India is ready to buy into the Haifa port of Israel, which we just mentioned, even then, that did not become a detrimental factor for India-Chabahar relationship. But what the article is trying to also say at the end before winding up is that it is time that US acts with more sensitivity. It is US diplomacy which needs to recognize that maintaining good ties with India will any day be beneficial for the US. Given that all the previous blames of India of being pro-Russia, of being extremely committed to NAM, of not supporting its trade partners, its diplomatic partners, but today nobody can actually label the country that way, because India has shown acute independence when it has taken this kind of stand. So therefore it is high time even US thinks back, works on its diplomacy, especially when it comes to internal policies of New Delhi. So it is completely India's decision, whether it's Iran or whether it's Israel investment, irrespective of what US feels about Iran or whether US feels it's appropriate given Iran's nature of its military arsenal development. So that's what the article talks about. All in all, it just laudates, it just appreciates India's stand. The article also says that US recent remarks regarding potential sanctions that might be imposed on the Chabahar airport, they seem like a very limp statement. That's a very short-sighted comment. It's coming in the wake of Iran-US relationship. But US needs to see it on a very, very different scale. It needs to see it as an economic and as a trade connectivity reality between two countries, much more than any ideological similarity between the two. Also, India's relation with Iran and the development of Chabahar Airport and many other alternatives that India has chosen to avoid China-backed projects is also a very big reality that US should focus upon. Now, we know that being a very integral member of Quad, India and US both understand that the realities today in the Indo-Pacific or in the South China Sea are far from normal. We all know, and both the countries do have an understanding. They have spoken about this in the past, that ultimately these initiatives like Quad, all the military maneuvers that are happening together, supplying good nuclear submarines to Australia, all these ultimately are acting as a counter move to China's aggression. So despite knowing that, any criticism of India's deal with Chabahar would sound like a very, very hypocritical stand by the US as per the article. So the article urges the US administration to have a more practical, a more pragmatic approach and understand that on the one hand, countries do have bitterness and countries do have cordial ties. But today, focusing on economic success and expanding trade is a way big reality, especially for countries who have a population as massive as that of India and who are also improving their economic standing day after another. So in future, the article says that India also needs to diversify its dealings with the West Asian countries. Of course, Chabahar is a great success, but even apart from this, we need to continue, re-establish certain other bilateral deals with even Iran for that matter, because that's in best interest of India. Now, most of these countries are major traders of oil. India does export major oil from these countries. So for India, it's a very, very important channel of trade. And US then in that case needs to accommodate these interests of New Delhi before taking it in a negative way or before thinking of creating any sanctions for India-West Asia projects as such. So, viewing Chabahar as a leverage against Iran policies in West Asia, this kind of negative attitude that when you deal with Iran, you are overlooking many other activities that Iran is engaged with, is a kind of very narrow-minded outlook, and this needs to get broader with times to come, and it needs to be seen that for any country like India today, if it is poising to become the 7th largest economy very soon, in that case, it has to prioritize its economic needs. So that's all in all the argument of the article here. With this, at page number 8, GS paper 3, another article corresponding to ecology, environment, it says that is just cutting down native species and implanting exotic species in its place a deep, proper, systematic solution to combat climate crisis, to improve air quality and to improve carbon sequestration? The article says no, that's not a pragmatic approach. Now, we might question what are these exotic species. So exotic species are those species which are not native. They have not developed or grown in a particular region. They are not endemic to a region. In fact, these are the species of trees which have been introduced from outside. Okay? And two examples here could be the acacia and eucalyptus, which is predominantly found in most of states in India. In fact, sometimes in many of the so-called special economic zone regions, you will see massive eucalyptus implantation. Why? It's easy to implant. It's an exotic species, it grows really fast. It doesn't need that much care, it doesn't need that much attention, and still it really spreads off very easily. So it could have an ornamental value, agreed. It could have an aesthetic value, agreed. But when it comes to the real purpose of a plant or a tree, carbon sequestration and climate combat, that is not something that shall be possible in future if you go on chopping off the native varieties and transplanting them with exotic varieties. Now, this is the key argument of the article. The article is highlighting Kerala here as the focus, and the article is saying that the Kerala government had issued an order under which many trees under the Kerala Forest Development Corporation, the KFDC, they could be cut off and they could be replaced by eucalyptus. Okay, this is what the article is focusing upon, but later environmentalists had created a storm about this announcement. The environmentalists criticized this policy of the government completely because they knew that any such move is going to devastate the ecology, the native endemic ecology of this area. So therefore the government later, it just stepped back on its policy. But at the same time, even today the government is ready to plant eucalyptus in spots of certain native existing species which have become very, very old now. So the article says that this is a very lame policy, it's a very short-sighted policy, because what happens is that every tree has a certain carbon sequestration rate. Now we know that there are certain trees in India like the Ashoka tree, like the mango tree, of course the neem tree, the banyan tree. These trees are known to have a very high rate of carbon absorption, the rate at which they absorb carbon dioxide from atmosphere and they release oxygen. That improves the air quality. Plus, it's the only solution if we are to create any step towards reducing our carbon footprint in order to combat the carbon sinks which urban cities have become, in order to create some kind of climate mitigation initiative. That's something that needs to be thought of. So therefore, this policy in the long run will only lead to more suffering and erosion of ecology. Why? One thing is plants like eucalyptus, although they grow really fast, they adapt very quick. But when you talk about carbon sequestration, it doesn't happen at the same rate like that of native species. Second problem is plants which are non-native species, sometimes they are also known as invasive species. Reason why they are called invasive species is because once they are introduced into a new place, they spread very fast. A point of time comes when they are able to drive out the native species into extinction. That's one potential fear. Because if this happens, then invasive species also are very vulnerable to any kind of, say, fire episode in forest, to any kind of ecological degradation, to any kind of infection. They are the first ones to suffer in the case of this situation, whereas the native species are way more sustainable. So that's also one thing the article is pointing out towards. So the Kerala government is today saying that we are trying to replace exotic species with natural one to mitigate human wildlife conflict and to protect our ecosystem. After enough fighting and after enough campaigning by the environmentalists, finally the government decided to take back the policy that it had announced of removing the native species, and now the government is saying that we shall introduce the ecological restoration policy that was announced earlier in 2021. Under this policy, issues related to invasive species and the harm that they have will be considered. So therefore today the government is saying that yes, it indeed earlier was a very short-sighted step. Rather than blindly introducing exotic species like this, we better protect our native species. It has been found that whenever native species are growing thoroughly in a particular belt of a geographical area, the human-animal conflict is also minimized, because native species not only provide food to various wildlife animal species, but also they prevent the loss of underground water. In any case, it's beneficial for animals and hence humans as well. Environmental activists are saying that when you allow eucalyptus planting constantly by removing the native species, you are doing nothing to mitigate climate crisis today. In fact, what we need is ecological restoration efforts, such as slowly phasing out. We can't do it abruptly, of course, but slowly reducing the extent of exotic species, just like eucalyptus and many such which we discussed, and replacing them with natural forest. Natural forests are way more lush, they are thicker, they are denser, they provide better habitat for wildlife animals, they provide much better herbs, they provide much better, they also provide for much better food, as I said, for not just wildlife animals, but they also lead to underground water preservation. Their roots are able to do that. They are able to hold the region better. Plus, they are also sustainable. They deal much better with climate change or any infection as compared to native species. And obviously, they will also do a higher degree of carbon sequestration. So, in some areas, projects supported by organizations, they already have initiated the process of removing exotic species and restoring the natural fauna back in its place. Natural flora back in its place. Natural plants and trees back in its place. The article mentions one of the very successful projects known as Marayur Sandal Division. Here, exotic species, when they were removed and the native species were introduced back, it led to rivers and rivulets, water streams developing back again. Even water streams which had dried up, they came back to life only by planting more and more native species. After a 30-year gap, water bodies were reviving. So that is one avid benefit that's visible of this initiative. So the article says that today there is a conflict going on. On the one hand, the government's dilemma of actually completely stopping eucalyptus plantation and removing the existing ones and allowing native species to have better eco-restoration. But at the same time, whether it is a step that should be taken immediately and implemented statewide, or only in certain key areas the step needs to be done and the remaining areas can continue with the earlier policy of exotic species implanted in between with the natural species. So that is the dilemma that the article was talking about. Well, the next one is a short one. It talks about the ongoing cyclone, and we are talking about Cyclone Remal, how it has made a landfall in Kolkata, of course bringing with it a spate of heavy rainfall, a situation where not just some people got injured but also the entire city became paralyzed. There was waterlogging that was happening, and it also highlights to slightly a bigger problem, because on the face of it, it's just a tropical cyclone which has caused devastation. Again, something not new in India, particularly in the low-lying regions, urban regions. But what the article is also pointing out is to the rather misunderstood problem of urban flooding. Now, just 10 years before, urban flooding was not a very recurrent phenomena. But as urbanization, concretization has increased, it's not just cities like Bengaluru or Chennai, but even Calcutta, Mumbai, of course, every year, that comes a spate of heavy rainfall, or any area that is coastal, proximity to a coast, it experiences any cyclone like this, like the ongoing Remal cyclone. The first problem that is occurring is urban flooding. Because of concretization, the water just comes and collects. in areas, low-lying areas of the city, it has no outlet. It leads to not only devastation of infrastructure, it leads to paralyzing life, but in the spate of it, it also brings then many kind of communicable diseases like cholera, typhoid, and many such, hepatitis A. These infections, they just take human residents by a storm when there is an urban flooding episode going on. Also at the same time, medical services and other basic services become paralyzed. Now every year we see this situation recurring in Indian cities. So also there is a hidden question made by the article that when we know that there are certain coastal areas in India which are constantly prone to such flooding, constantly prone to such tropical cyclones. You talk about Assam, West Bengal, Odisha, Andhra, you talk about Maharashtra, you talk about, of course, Calcutta. All such areas need to have a much stronger, sustainable, ambitious policy to control urban flooding. Now, many things here come into picture. We can talk about the Sponge City Mission. In 2015, the government had spoken about it. It was an idea borrowed by China. But till date, in most of the cities, we lack that kind of a mechanism where you create a sponge across the city to absorb any extra water. So that's the need of the hour. Apart from that, also, the low-lying areas of the city need to be particularly made in such a way that at least concretization is avoided on wetlands. For example, there are dry lakes or there are riverbeds that have gone dry. They are seasonal in nature. So any habitation near those areas means and spells danger. These are the problems when you encroach a water body, whether it's dry or whether it's seasonal. Ultimately, urban flooding will become a recurrent problem. In fact, even in Bengaluru, which once was known for tremendous number of lakes, in just the last 10 years, as the lakes became encroached and urbanization spread everywhere. For a long time, people waited for the comeback. And now, just in the last 2 years, we've seen that every time the southwest monsoons makes a heavy fall, the first thing that happens is that the city goes flooded. It becomes completely paralyzed. The newer constructions are the first one to get paralyzed. Why? Because they look very posh and upmarket. But in reality, they have been made in such a way that they are encroaching all the wetland. So this is a bigger reality that we need to focus. Otherwise, what happens every year, the same story, when the cyclone like this one is making a landfall in West Bengal and Bangladesh, it is leading to uprooting of not just trees, killing many more people. It's a danger to animals. It leads to destruction of property. It leads to economic losses at unprecedented scale. Plus, it also leads to a situation where residents are stranded helplessly. So that was the article. Now, the last article for the day is page 13. It's Economy GS Paper 3, and it says how Ghana has become one of its own kind African country which has signed up a deal with Reliance Jio, Tech Mahindra, and many other such commercial vendors to build 4G and 5G infrastructure in the nation. Why? When you talk about Ghana, Ghana is outstanding as compared to many other African nations because Ghana also has a very developing economy. It's one of the few such economies in Africa where there is tremendous potential of development and growth. So therefore, this decision comes in the light of how countries like this, which are now on the path towards development, they see India as a shining star. We know that India's telecommunication revolution has meant that today India is in a situation where it can inspire many such countries of Africa and Asia which are highly populated and still developing. Such countries today are being encouraged to adapt telecommunication revolution like never before, and this decision of Ghana comes in that light. In fact, the leadership of Ghana has clearly said that India's demographic profile is pretty much like ours. We have a young population, we have a huge demographic dividend. So when we say that average Indian population is around 27.5 years, that's exactly the situation of your African countries. Fertility rate being pretty much high in these nations, just like few states in India. Overall, young population, ready working population, same like Ghana and many other African nations, plus a heavy population burden. So, since India is almost like a similar situation in terms of demography, countries like Africa could learn so much from the success model that India has showcased in a short span of time. The kind of telecommunication revolution, mobile revolution that we are boasting of, that is something that has acted as an inspiration, in this case to Ghana. It also says that Ghana is a part of South Africa Alliance and other countries that will be closely watching whether same kind of revolution in terms of telecommunication can actually take place here as today they are imagining to happen with, of course, technical and digital support from India. So Indian vendors have executed such plans in the past. They have already shown their success, and that's also the reason why countries like Ghana today are choosing Indian vendors over Chinese vendors. Also, it's a strategic choice for them because the article says that Ghana today wants to make the most, it wants to leverage on the benefits and experience that India has had in the past when it comes to technology. So this was it for the articles typically, and now we proceed with the two practice questions for the day. The first question, a 20 marks question, says, is there a cultural dynamic? Is there a cultural dimension, you can say, to the stray cattle menace in agriculture farms in the Terai region of India? We are talking about the North Indian Northern Plain region, the extremely fertile belt which is known for its massive biodiversity, excellent agriculture output, fertile soils, river valleys. And here, since there is a good amount of wildlife present, there is an excellent agriculture that's flourishing here. So today it is coming at a crossroad of human-animal conflict, but is it just a pure animal-human conflict? Or as we mentioned, is it also about the cultural, religious beliefs of people that today the stray cattle are not being able to take care of? Nobody is ready to claim the responsibility. So that's what you need to mention. Quite a creative question there. Second question says critically analyze, which means please write the benefits and the negatives, the pro and the cons both. The recent decision of the Kerala government to permit or to allow Kerala Forest Development Corporation to plant eucalyptus trees in the light of environmental concerns and state eco-restoration policy. How does this decision impact the efforts to mitigate human-wildlife conflict and to preserve natural ecosystems? We just spoke about it, that how whenever you plan to remove native species and replace it with invasive exotic species like eucalyptus, what happens? The carbon sequestration slows down, wildlife conflict increases, wildlife also gets scattered because of lack of food. And apart from that, it is also a very big question of taking away the life and livelihoods of so many communities who depend on indigenous forests for their economic needs. So all those questions come into picture here, and how, if we need to restore ecology, we must think of preventing the native species which are more sustainable, which are a longer term solution for climate crisis as compared to the band-aid solution of just coming and growing trees like eucalyptus, palm and all of that. So that was it for the day. I hope you enjoyed this session. I'll see you very soon with another such interesting analysis session for the news. In the meantime, take care and thank you for being with us.